I understand that the Harith recently closed its first fund with 625 million, all from African institutions. Is that right? And you are already working on the number 2 fund. Could you share with us your observations of the opportunities in Africa from your vantage point?
Thank you very much. I think I just want to acknowledge Mr. Brian Molefe, the current CEO of Transnet. He's been very instrumental of establishing our first fund in his previous life as CEO of the Public Investment Corporation. But thank you very much for this opportunity. We've closed our first fund of 625 million in September 2007. To date, we've invested in about 10 projects all over the continent, west, east, south, north, Africa. We've participated with Andrew and his team in 2, I think it's 2, Andrew? Yeah. Transactions. So we've invested 380 odd million in our participation in these projects that created projects in the region of about $2.5 billion. These projects, infrastructure investment in Africa is quite different from what one finds really in Europe and in the East, where there's very little scope for secondary market at this stage, and that's purely because there's no assets available in the market. And both Andrew and ourselves with our funds are involved in early stage greenfields projects. So at the same time of investing in Africa and getting a return for our investors, we're also creating a lot of job opportunities. We're creating big businesses, and with the hope of in 10 years' time from now, one will see an active secondary market in these assets class that would create a bigger pool of funds coming into Africa as fixed investment. I think we're currently in the process of raising our second fund. We aim to close the second fund by the end of March, April next year. It's going fairly well. There's quite a lot of appetite, but again, we find most of the appetite is Africa institutions and the traditional DFIs. In the United States, we find very little appetite for Africa in this asset class. I think it's for 2 reasons. The asset class is not a well-known asset class in the United States. They don't really know private infrastructure. And then, of course, Africa is not on the radar of the United States. At this stage. They're looking closer to home, South America. So we find appetite in Africa. We find appetite in Europe. The East is very difficult. I think the East prefers to do business with Africa on a basis of export-based, whether it's goods or whether it's intellectual capital. They prefer the export base instead of investing direct into assets where there's little contribution from the entities. But at the same time, I think, I think my question that was asked of me is infrastructure related to trade. I think it's a very easy question to answer. Infrastructure that is trade related revolves around the transport sector and the power sector. The problem one finds with these transactions is a typical transport transaction, and there's not a, as Andrew mentioned earlier, the wish list of governments is not demand-driven infrastructure, it's supply-driven infrastructure. So these projects creates a scenario where supply the infrastructure and demand will come, where typically private equity and private investors prefer the demand to be there first before the projects are supplied and the infrastructure is supplied. So I think a lot of thought needs to go into how one structures projects where it's a supply-based project, where one would create these opportunities for inter-country and cross-border trade, like building the airports, building the roads, building the rails, building the ports. One cannot build a single-lane road, and you can't build the road from Harare to Petersburg instead of Harare to Johannesburg. For instance, one's got to build the whole project. Now, currently, demand studies around these projects are very difficult and very unsupporting of these projects, of these major projects. So as Africans, we got to find structures that would accommodate the supply side of infrastructure going forward. And my honest belief is that will open up cross-border trade, it will open up regional trade once we can implement this. It's not being implemented because we do not have the structures, financial structures, to accommodate this. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.